The Kodo were so close to conquering the Mens system, so close. But, seemingly it was never meant to be, not on a few-year time span at least. The problem was that there was a Alvia Jihad Haolik flood force floating around the star system. With the amount of war, death, and Vilburnets in the system, they would inevitably catch wind of the situation. And once they did, they were on their way immediately. It was in the outer ships of the Menswort fleet that bore the brunt of the Haolik vanguard. Hundreds of ships and millions of Ep4 soldiers fought in the bloody battles of the Haolik vanguard. Hordes of Haolik Death Nas would board ships and slowly kill the crew. For instance, in the ruins of a Stardius-class destroyer there was a data core recovered that told the story of a Death Noah incursion into the children of the Ep4 ship. Suddenly, there was a massive crash on the starboard side of the vessel. The entirety of the ship's innards shook with a vibration that could only have been caused by the violent docking of another space vessel. I, and my other close crewmates immediately headed to a chain of command mouthpiece who told us to armor up and prepare to defend the ship from a Haolik flood incursion. Almost instantly after the words left the mouth of the cyborg, the lights on the ships turned to a dim red and an alarm began to blare across what I could only imagine was the entirety of the ship. The corridor that we were in suddenly was cut off from the rest of the ship. The doors on either side closing. Besides the alarm and our heavy, well, more like nervous, breath, there was no other noise around us. Unlike the commanders and captain of this ship, we were lowly baselines. A mix of humans, high-entity, Podasco, Dwarfman, and a Waller. We all stood back to back, looking around the room with worry. After a few seconds, however, two horrifying sounds rung out through the ship. The sound of a synthesized, yet still fleshy and wet screech, and the sound of the alarm failing and sputtering off with a computerized death cry. We were left standing in the red glow of the light. Complete silence smothered us. Suddenly, we heard screeching from down one of the halls. It grew closer and closer. The sound of metal scraping on metal came into hearing range. But there was something else too, amongst the clattering and screaming and screeching and wailing. Music. There was a fast-paced yet staggered and glitchy tune getting louder and louder as the other sounds came closer to us. At the point that the sounds became so loud I couldn't even hear my own thoughts, hundreds of Death Now burst through the door, pouring through and slaughtering the dozen or so comrades I had standing in front of me mere seconds ago. As they had slowed down to tear the rest of my crewmates limb from limb, I managed to jump into a vent at the bottom of the wall and crawl to safety. That's where I am now, recording this. I can hear them coming, their scraping and screaming getting louder and louder, closer and closer. Unknown combatant, N9.315. Massive swathes of the Kodo fleet were crippled in this manner, either being destroyed or taken over. Converted it into massive shiphetal, a creature whose body shape resembles a spacecraft. Spaceship, with massive mechanical arms, heads, and guns protruding out of the hull. Once the main splinter of the Alvia Jihad, the Mens Alvia, arrived at the system, they engaged in a war in the outer and mid-solar system, encompassing the Menswort fleet, the Mens Haolik splinter Alvia Jihad, the world of Orville, and the world of Urialtith as well as its 7 moons. In this majority system war the 16-pointed star of the Reaper was used countless times. Its massive green beams tearing across the system and destroying untold ships and stations. One of the SSS Fortress moons, SSSI to be specific, was actually converted into a moon barge through release of a legion of tiny constructo nanobots onto its surface. The moon barge SSSI, M.B.SSS.IRM-CCC, made its way from world to world, deploying drop factories. Basically compressed factories that are dropped from space. Once they land on the world they begin to expand and create basically any type of product needed to behind friendly fronts. It would also dump its waste products, nuclear waste, sewerage, ECT, onto sections of worlds that were known to be occupied by Haolik flood. Its greatest battle, and also last, would come in Romeo, N9.315. It was around the still-burning world of Urialtith. Millions of Haolik flood ships were gathered in a cluster around the world in what was believed to be preparation for an immense attack on Neaolebeth. The MC was alerted to this already immense and still growing biomechanical horde. Now normally the 16-pointed star of the Reaper would take care of this great threat. But at that point, it was embroiled in a massive war of its own. So it was up to the MC to take care of the situation. Going into the battle it deployed hundreds of thousands of Stardius-class destroyers, and the battle begun. Laser beams and firework assault turrets gave it everything they had. If it wasn't a war, then the amount of extravagant weapons that were being used, and their colorful byproduct creations, would have been a beautiful sight to see. There were untold smaller battles fought in this incalculably large battle. Dogfights, cyber wars, and even biomecha and mecha titan clashes on the outside hulls of ships. It was one of the single most expensive battles in the larger war to reclaim Ment's prime. But even though the forces of the children of the Ep4 had put up a superb fight, it was just too much. If they wanted to conventionally wipe the fleet out entirely, each Kodo ship would have to destroy 40 Haolik flood ships. It wasn't a sustainable front, but something had to be done about it, otherwise the Kodo faced total defeat. So a final solution was enacted. MC diverted all of its weapons power to its STL, slower than light, thrusters. Over only a minute it accelerated to just under the speed of light. As soon as the MC was in the center of the Haolik cluster, they overloaded the reactor, causing it to destabilize and explode. This explosion was said to outshine the star for over a minute, in the process spewing out hundreds of trillions of tons of radioactive and highly dangerous fuel. The dangerous part about it being its strange nature. The MC used a very rare strange matter reactor to power its weapons, thrusters, and other miscellaneous processors. But when it self-destructed in the cluster of Haolik flood, it spewed all of this reactor material into the void of space, hitting the majority of the already tiny remnant of Haolik flood ships that survived the explosion. The problem is that strange matter is one of the most perfect states of matter. So perfect in fact it converts any normal matter it touches into itself, resulting in it being one of the most dangerous states of being in the universe. But it wasn't just the targets that were hit by the arrow. The strange matter was flung out into a massive cloud that orbited the star of Ments, called, funnily enough, the MC Strange Cloud. The Battle of Yin Yang Das was already well underway when the Haolik flood arrived. Funnily enough, however, the Haolik had saved the world from a stalemate of bunkers, beams, and brutality. The War of Yin Yang Das had been raging for months, and after the Kodo had conquered the mostly toxic world of Yin Yang Das 2, the war had devolved into a war of probes. War satellites and kill probes were sent at the speed of light between each world, bombing, burning, and even just ramming the enemy world at relativistic speeds, causing immense damage. Due to this constant bombarding, the two planets would receive massive extensive bunker networks, like the ones on Urialtith, were constructed. There were even plans by the Kadeshi High Generals to create a worldwide force field. However, these plans never materialized. Resources on the worlds were running low and they were beginning to experience Stage 8 Kessler Syndrome. Kessler Syndrome being the consistent clogging of the world's atmosphere. Eventually it reaches a point where space debris running into each other causes a knock-on effect to occur where more and more, much smaller space rubbish is created, making sending missions, probes, and more satellites exponentially harder. Stage 8 Kessler Syndrome means that the debris is so thick in the atmosphere that it is visibly noticeable from the ground. But when the Haolik flood arrived, and subsequently drew the greater attention of the Kodo, the artisans of the children of the Ep4 and the Kadeshi were left to their own devices. Left to either continue this war, wearing each other down and in the process leaving themselves both vulnerable to Haolik attack, or they could sign a temporary peace treaty, maybe even a loose alliance to combat the biomechanical menace. And the two violently rival civilizations chose the latter. The Treaty of Convenient Peace was signed by Polymath Artisan, which is the Kodo equivalent of a planetary leader or planetary scale commanding general, the ranks from lowest to highest being Apprentice Artisan, Mason Artisan, Intermediate Artisan, Chief Artisan, High Artisan, and Polymath Artisan. Arishu Ket and Kadeshi Wet Mind, a wet mind being a group of Kadeshi bodies all being linked together through emerged consciousness, creating one entirely new being, Lisha Dada on the 6th of Pieces, N9.316, and called for an immediate ceasefire. Now with the additional time and resources that could be dedicated to the fortifying of the worlds, the Kadeshi plan for a worldwide force field was reconsidered, and after a month of planning and preparation, construction began. The impressive Kadeshi engineers and builders managed to finish the projector pylons in under 3 months, having the array fully operational by late Opharian. On the 49th of Opharian, N9.316, the blue sky of Yin Yang Dasa lit up for a second in an outward expanding circle of protection. The children of the Ep4 went in the opposite direction. It increased the severity of the Kessler Syndrome, making it the 10th and final stage. On the surface of the world, a massive grid system was constructed, each square being 1 kilometer squared. Millions of train-like vehicles sped around the world, carrying super artillery, new atomic weapons, ground-to-orbit railguns, and many more weapons platforms. They would crisscross around the world, and in tandem with a planet-wide array of sensors and telescopes, they would be able to detect and destroy any off-world forces. However, this vast defense array carpeted the entirety of the surface of the world, forcing the Kodo to move underground into a massive 3-kilometer deep subterranean space. This enormous area was situated 2 kilometers underground and existed across the entire world. Massive undercities were built to house the citizenry, soldiery, and commanding officers of the world. All of this powered by an ancient 3KSM fusion reactor. 3KSM standing for 3K class stellar masses, meaning that it had the output of 3K class stars when at full capacity, that was found deep in the core of the world. With the sacrifice of them, though, it seemed that the preparations were unnecessary. After all, the Haolik flood threat in the system had been eliminated, never to return. Or at least that's what it seemed.
Hope you enjoyed the video, plenty more on the way. Once again, don't forget to unlike and to subscribe from the channel, and you bloody better tune into the next one or I'll steal your bathroom sink.